It's Sunday night, 6 p.m. Pacific, and we're back for Steve's Place. Sorry for the our absence these last couple of weeks, but that was due to YouTube playing games, with some of the videos we put up there. One of the things we learned is that it appears like if you have them the members only, they really don't censor you so much. It's when we make them public that the censors start coming down hard on us. So uh, I encourage everyone to become a members. Um, for the $9.99 memberships. That way you'll be able to see all of the videos, and you won't have to worry about the any YouTube censorship happening in that area. So that's a plus there. Uh, the other thing I want to talk to you about is our upcoming conference in Albuquerque. It's only going to be in 2 weeks. So we have one more week where you can get the special rates on the hotel rooms for $82. So I encourage everyone for the next couple of days, get up there before uh, July 31st and get signed up for the rooms. And then while you're at it, come and register at the conference. If you register tonight after the show, I'll give you a 30% discount. Otherwise, 25%. If you sign up two people at the same time, you get an extra 5% discount. Uh, I can't encourage people to come to these enough. Don't wait till next year. There may not be a next year. The way the world is changing, you gotta take the bull by the horns and be there today. Now is the time for change. Now they need the technology. Now is the time to find out about it. So I encourage everyone to get up there and sign up for the conference. You know, and while you're at it, go to the YouTube channel, become a member. At least subscribe. That's free. But then the membership's like $9.99 a month, and it's a bargain. Anyway, without further ado, let me introduce you to uh, Glen Rein. Hang on here, Glenn. There you go, Glenn. So, Glenn, why don't you tell these people a little about yourself? For those who haven't been to our conferences in the past.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you okay.
Okay. So my background is in conventional biomedical research. I was an assistant professor at Mount Sinai Medical School. I worked at Stanford and Harvard and did conventional biomedical research, sort of conventional. When I was at Stanford, I did psychoneuroimmunology research, studying the effects of the mind on diseases. And actually, these days, I've become very interested in the mind because it's something that scientists really have no idea what it is. Biologists have no idea what it is. But I'm not going to talk to you about the mind today. I want to talk to you about my research with scalar energy. I set up my lab probably 40 years ago with a grant from the Fetzer Institute. Actually, they funded me to study the biological effects of scalar energy. And after going to the Tesla Tech conference for many years and whatever it was called before that in Colorado Springs, I got all excited about the idea of looking at the biological effects of the energies that are emitted from the various Tesla coils and the various ways of generating scalar energy, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and bring up the screen, and you can just go ahead and just jump right into it.
Okay, jumping right in. So here's my contact information. That's my website, which needs a lot of work, and I don't have time because I'm so busy running around giving lectures that I think is more important than the website. So I want to start with a little bit of a background about what scalar energy is and how it fits into biological systems. And in that regard, I have a hypothesis here, which is the proposal for a new energetic regulatory system in the body. Now, obviously, electromagnetic fields are known to do exactly that because you can see that electromagnetic energy is a precursor to the biochemistry in the body, meaning that it regulates and controls the biochemistry. But underlying the electromagnetic energy is what I call non-classical energy fields, of which there are many: scalar and longitudinal, and plasma energy, zero point energy. All those kind of energies that are not electromagnetic fall in that category. And then there's an even more fundamental kind of energy, which is a quantum energy or a quantum energy field, which underlies everything. And if you want to be religious about it, you can even go to more fundamental energies and introduce the concept of God and what are divine energies, let's put it that way, that underlie the quantum energy. So this is a distinction that's important because there's some people out there that are saying that scalar energy is the source of all energies, and it is the underlying energy from all other energies, and all other energies come from scalar energy. That is not true. It's definitely not true. Scalar energy is very close to the electromagnetic. It's a derivative of it's a kind of electromagnetic field. And there are much more fundamental fields than scalar energy. So this is the model that I'm proposing. And those little arrows, we can use the word underlie, we can use the word control, modulate, regulate. So that's my model of how energy heals the body in a nutshell. Now, somewhere in there is the mind, as we started to talk about, and that's not quite clear what the mind is made of. The mind is probably made of all those kind of energies above the biochemistry. So there we have my definition of mind. Mind is energy. Okay, so now in this regard, these same layers of energy are now kind of inverted, whereas the most fundamental energies, which could be called divine energy, it could be called consciousness, because consciousness is in some models the most fundamental energy. So we've got the healer and the healy, and these 5 different layers resonate with each other between the healer and the healy. The energies from consciousness are, as I said, are most fundamental, and they go out and up from there. And these are the different kinds of devices or physical energies that control the 5 different layers. And healers can work at the most fundamental level, which is why I do a lot of research with healers. Okay, so now we're back to, we're going to focus on this model. We're going to focus on the 3rd layer down from the physical, not the electromagnetic, because everyone knows about pulsed electromagnetic fields, and there's a whole scientific community that focuses on electromagnetic fields, and the scalar longitudinal energies are much less studied. But lo and behold, I lump them all together into the, as I said, non-classical energy, and I'm using the word non-classical electromagnetic energy. You can also have non-classical sound, and you can also have non-classical light. But the scientific community it has researched non-classical electromagnetic fields the most, and they have all kinds of names for them. And here are the bunch of names, and you can see they call them what it's not, because they don't know what it is. So they go, well, it's not Hertzian. Hertzian electromagnetic fields follow the laws of Maxwell and Hertz, and these non-classical fields do not. So here's a whole bunch of different kinds of terms that show up in the literature. And here's a whole bunch of some more terms that show up in the literature with a picture of a Beltrami helicoid field, which gives you some idea that an ordinary electromagnetic field radiates from the source as a sphere. So these old non-classical fields are definitely not electromagnetic. They have all kinds of bizarre shapes, as demonstrated here by this helicoid field that was discovered by Beltrami many years ago. And of course, again, there are many fields, and you can just read what names for these fields. Okay, so this is not the final version, because every time I thought I was saving the final version, it didn't save. So I don't know what's going on with my computer. Okay, so here's some more terms. The interesting new term that's in this one is time reversed. And time reversed fields, meaning negative time, is something in the equations that describe the energy fields that we're talking about. So, it's like the concept that normally time goes forward, but these fields that we're talking about propagate outside of space and time. So they can go backwards or forward in time. They can go into the past, and in principle, they can go into the future. So this is an important distinction. And these are the various properties. They're non-dispersive, non-diffracting, and self-sustaining, and all these magic words that they use in the scientific literature. Okay, so speaking of the scientific literature, let's look at the scientific literature. And I decided to really do a deep dive into what's published. And it all starts in 21 with Constantine Mile, who, bless his heart, published this in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and published his theory about the kind of electrical fields that can be scalar waves. But he actually also measured the transmission from a spherical antenna to another spherical antenna, and showed that they travel faster than the speed of light, and they can pass through a Faraday cage. Well, right there, we got two properties that distinguish scalar waves from ordinary electromagnetic fields. And Mile was really the first that I could find. Before 2001, there was nobody talking about scalar waves or even longitudinal waves. And then there was another guy from Scandinavia who published a theory. And then there was Monstein in a year later, published another theory and experimental verification of Mile's work, using a ball antenna and a receiver, using a slightly higher frequency, and he was able to demonstrate the transmission from one location to another. And he had a very elaborate theory to describe the nature, the theoretical validation for the phenomena that he was observing. And it's interesting to note that he said he uses a Laplace equation, not the Maxwell equations, which again tells you that these are not ordinary electromagnetic fields. And lots of people have tried to tweak the Maxwell's equations, and to a certain extent they've been successful, because you all remember the earlier, the full version of the Maxwell's equations that were shortened in modern times. And if you go back to the original versions, you can explain scalar waves. Okay, so now here we have an actual plot of the propagation of the scalar wave over distances from the transmitter. And you can see that it gradually falls off, but there are nodes at 75 feet and 128 feet. And then again at 120 feet. That's 128, sorry. And you can see by the time it gets to 1,600 feet, which is 0.3 of a mile, it's faded and it's gone back to zero. And this is a scientific confirmation that these fields do propagate, but not forever. And some people are touting that they last for 2.2 miles. And here, this is, I don't know, purportedly a measurement, but this was done by a scientist and published in a mainstream journal. So they don't go out for 2 miles. They go out for 0.3 of a mile. Okay, so that's another interesting property. And then continuing, we're up to 2004, when we have a Canadian scientist who again confirmed that the ball antenna was a proper way to emit not only a scalar wave, but also a classical electromagnetic field. And then there was a gap for 8 years. And then Mile re-emerged with a more elaborate theoretical model, again, based on Laplace's wave equation. and bringing into a point that the scalar waves are not A fields, although they have certain properties of a monopole. They're not an A field, and that's an important distinction because that's been debated for a long time. And that's the A field is the magnetic vector potential, but in Miles' article, he talks about potential vortexes and introduces the whole idea that the scalar waves propagate in a vortexual manner and radiate from a plasma wave. So this is another one of these controversial statements because we have all these other kinds of energy fields like plasmas. In the big debate has been, is that a scalar wave or is that yet another kind of wave? So here, Mile has got mathematical validation that the scalar wave at least is emitted from a plasma wave. Plasma waves are very complex and they can contain more than one kind of field. In fact, they're a conglomeration of fields, which include scalar. Okay, so now moving on to 2012. Where were we before? 2012. In the same year, he published this article about DNA as a source of scalar waves in the body. And he has no experimental evidence, but he does talk about the relationship in detail to the scalar waves and DNA and the role of scalar waves and information waves in the nucleus and even mediating chemical reactions and even more fundamentally as the basis of all life. So this is probably where people are saying, well, this is the most fundamental energy because it's the basis of all life, but that's not true. Okay, so since 2012, or in addition to the articles that I just mentioned, there have been a couple of more recent ones, and Donald Reed and Hively, in particular, quite recently published a series of articles based not on Laplace's equations, but based on electrodynamic theory, and they have kind of taken the whole scalar longitudinal wave to the next level. And they are now calling them officially longitudinal scalar waves. So that is the LSW is now the accepted term in the physics community, and this is the work of Hively that I just mentioned, extended electrodynamics, and this theory predicts two different kinds of scalar waves. Actually, the kind that's associated with charge fluctuations, which would be the ordinary kind, and then what he calls a longitudinal electric field, which is exactly what Mile described several years prior. So for the record, he also distinguishes the A field and says the A field are related to scalar waves, but not equal to scalar waves. And in the mathematics, he ends up contributing a longitudinal component to some of the mathematical entities like the vector potential and current density in all these equations. And that, again, he validates the ability of this kind of wave to propagate, but that it propagates through conducting media. So the fact that the scalar waves can propagate in ordinary dimensions of space and time is an interesting statement because a lot of people say, well, they're beyond space and time and they propagate in five-dimensional reality. So perhaps they're capable of doing both, but that raises an intellectual challenge because the equations seem to indicate that it's not higher dimensional and can propagate in ordinary space-time. Okay, so now this slide was supposed to have some more stuff, but there is scientific evidence for longitudinal scalar waves in the body. They actually have been measured, and they are known to propagate through bone. So longitudinal scalar waves are in the body. And then, of course, Mile was the one that proposed they radiate from the DNA. So therefore, not only are they in hard tissue, but they are actually in every cell and every nucleus of the body. So if the body contains these longitudinal scalar waves, then they should be sensitive to external longitudinal scalar waves. And that's the basis for my whole study and everything I've done in terms of not studying the presence of these fields in the body, but studying the sensitivity of the body to external fields. And this is an overview of some of the experiments that were done. Probably Eldon Bird was one of the first people to show it could change brain waves, and then there are all the other people came along, including myself, that did some research. And Andrea Puharich actually did some experiments with gene expression, and Mei-Wan Ho did some experiments at embryogenesis. And this is the stuff that's in the literature back in the 1990s, when I kind of entered the picture and did my own research, which I'm going to summarize for you in the next couple of slides. So before we go into the details of my experiments, we need a little bit of an overview about how to generate scalar waves, longitudinal waves in the lab. Because that's the reason I could do these experiments, because, quantum fields, I haven't figured out how to generate them in the lab. So I can't do experiments with them. So we all know about self-canceling coils, of which there are many. And Tesla was probably the first person to use the flat counterwound coil, where the energy goes in on one direction and out in the opposite direction, and they cancel. And then the bifilar coil, and the Caduceus coil, and the Mobius coil, and the Rodin coil. And then here's the way of generating an A field, the magnetic vector potential. So remember, we've now learned that this is not a scalar wave. It's another kind of non-classical electromagnetic field, but I've actually done some work with these as well. And another way that I generated these fields is through Bob Beck's device, which is depicted here as built by Al Kaspersky, who actually knew Bob Beck personally, and Bob Beck explained how to do it before he passed. And Al, being an engineer, said, "Oh, I can build that." And the tricky part is it's two coils, as you can see, connected by a spot weld. And the spot weld introduces a nonlinearity, which creates the scalar wave. Plus, the two coils that are depicted here are out of phase, and the other electrical engineering characteristics are depicted here. And the beauty of this system is that I have a control, which is the exact same setup without the spot weld. So there's no scalar component. It's just an ordinary electromagnetic field at the same frequency that I've used to generate the scalar. So I can do a direct comparison between a scalar and a classical electromagnetic field. Okay, now, are there other ways of generating scalar waves? Plasma waves, we just heard, is a source of scalar waves. The human biofield, is that a source of scalar waves? Well, I just told you that there are scalar waves in the body. So therefore, they are radiating from the body. So yes, healers and biofield experiments can be considered a kind of scalar wave. The problem about the human body is, and the plasma waves for that matter, they generate lots of energies, not just a scalar wave. So you certainly have an ordinary electromagnetic field, and you have light, and you have scalars, and you have all kinds of energy. So it's a very complex system. And then the next question is, do geometric shapes radiate, like pyramids, radiate a scalar wave? And there is no theory behind that, because there's no canceling two fields bucking each other at 180 degrees. So that's a big fat question mark. But I have done some experiments with geometric shapes, which hopefully I'll get to at the end. Okay, so here's some experiments I did with Bob Beck's device. In this case, it was water, not a biological system. Using, it turns out that 432 hertz is a very effective frequency to treat water. And you get a very large decrease in resistance or an increase in conductivity. I measure electrical properties, which I'll explain in a minute. And here I'm showing you the decrease in the resistance or impedance, which is proportional to an increase in conductivity. The point I'm making here is that different kinds of water have very different kinds of effects. Electrocyte is a special mineral solution that's predominantly negatively charged and is designed to pull out positive toxins. But there's a water called Vivo, which is structured water, proven to be structured water with NMR spectroscopy. It lasts for 2 years. It has all kinds of beneficial biological effects. This talk is not about water, but note that it is not affected like all the other kinds of waters. And why is that? Because it's structured in a hexagonal structure, and the structure is so rigid, if you will, it cannot take on new information. This is the first time that's ever been discovered, because people talk about structured water and imprinting and all of that kind of stuff. But, here's the proof. It doesn't really imprint very well. Okay, so moving on from water, now we're moving into a company that I actually consult for, working for, called Global Healing. And they make these liquid herbal extracts, which are awesome. And what I did in this particular experiment, using their vitamin C, I actually measured the frequencies of their vitamin C product. And I'll explain that a little later in the talk when I get into the DNA story. But in these experiments, I took there are probably like 10 different frequencies that are intrinsic to this vitamin C extract. I took 3 of those frequencies and fed them back onto the liquid vitamin C and lowered the resistance or increased the conductivity by about 35%. So, and these are in the range of about 20 kilohertz. Their frequencies higher and lower. Each of these, depending on where you look at, there are many different frequencies. And I just chose those particular frequencies, and they turn out to be effective when played back to the system. So the idea is you feed back its own energy and you enhance its energetic properties. And Global Healing is quite interested in bringing the awareness of this technology and this whole idea of the energy of a product to the marketplace. Okay, so moving on from herbal extracts, we're moving on to DNA. So I've done a lot of experiments with DNA, and I hope I have time to talk about all of them, but I've done these 5 different kinds of measurements. I've measured the etheric DNA using radionics. I measured DNA synthesis, which is the ability of cells in tissue culture to replicate and multiply. This is a standard biochemical assay, DNA for cell replication via DNA synthesis. I measured the conformation or shape of the DNA, i.e. its helical shape. I measured the electrical conductivity, as I just described, and I measured the frequencies. So get ready for a whirlwind ride. The first experiment I did was with a Tesla coil, which generates a plasma wave, which we now know has a scalar component. This was done with the Tesla lights, the Nova lights, and the Therify are actually 3 different devices that generate these kind of plasma waves. in the case of the Therify, they're spinning and they're counter-rotating, and you kind of sit in the middle. But there are several devices like this on the market. So what I did was I used that device. Well, okay, so here we are talking about the measurement. Sorry. So I used a radionic device to measure the vitality, and the measurements were done 1,500 miles away. So I'm in my lab in Boston. Peter Moscow is in his lab in the Midwest somewhere, and I'm stimulating the DNA with the plasma from the device. Okay, I put the DNA right in the plasma field from the device, and then he measures the energetics with a test radionics device, and at the same time I'm in the lab and I'm measuring the absorption of light at a particular wavelength, which is a standard way to measure the shape of the DNA, how it's winding how wound and unwound it is. So actually, what happened was it did unwind, and then over time, it wound back up into the helix conformation. And that's why the numbers go down, because that's the way it works. The more intact it is, the less it absorbs light, and apparently the less it absorbs radionic energy as well, because that's also decreasing. So here you can see at time zero, we're treating the DNA with a plasma wave, and we're measuring the physical DNA and the etheric DNA in real time, side by side, 1,500 miles apart. And you can see that so it's going down, but right about here at about 5 minutes, there's an increase in the energetics, but there's no increase in the physical DNA. Then you keep going, and then again at about 10 minutes, you see that there's an increase, which means it's not unwinding, it's not rewinding, it's unwinding for a second, and at that time point, both the physical DNA and the etheric DNA show this glitch, and then it just keeps going on, continuing to rewind back to its helical shape. So this was a fun experiment, and it shows you that in some cases the energetic properties of the molecule can change before the physical properties, and there is no correlation. The energy changes, whereas later they correlate. So to me, that's a really interesting and exciting experiment. Okay, so now the experiments from here on in are done with one kind of a coil or another, and here's the in the electromagnetic mode or in the self-canceling mode, and then you expose the energy to DNA or cells in tissue culture, and you measure the various changes that I mentioned in the previous slide. So we're going to start with the effects of scalar waves on DNA synthesis. That's the ability of the cell to replicate. And I did this or proliferate. And I did this with lymphocytes, which are immune cells, which I took from humans and purified them and grew them in tissue culture and measured the DNA replication by the standard scientific method, the incorporation of one of the base precursors into the DNA. And this was published in the US Psychotronics Journal when they had a journal, because this was just too far out to go into a mainstream journal. And here's the results. So we did it with a flat Tesla coil and a regular electromagnetic coil. The signal was a complex series of modulated square waves, and I used the magnetometer to measure the residual magnetic fields, and we did it pretty rigorously, and these are the results. So the control again was a regular electromagnetic field with the same set of frequencies, and here's the scalar longitudinal wave, which is a huge increase, quite similar in magnitude to that obtained with interleukin 2. This is a cytokine known to stimulate lymphocyte proliferation. So this energetic thing stimulus is almost the same as the chemical stimulus. And then, well, what happens if you add the two together? Well, there's no additional increase, suggesting that they're occurring by a similar mechanism. If they were two separate mechanisms and then you put them side by side, the two different treatments, you would get a synergism. So that's an interesting observation. Okay, so here's the next series of experiments, not measuring DNA synthesis, but measuring the shape of the helix. So it turns out the helix has the ability, as I just told you with the radionics experiment, to wind tighter down here and looser up here. So this is kind of like unwinding, and this is winding tighter at the bottom. And you can measure this with absorption of light at 260 nanometers with a spectrophotometer. Nice, hardcore biochemical measurement, standard biochemical way of measuring the winding and unwinding of the two strands. And in this case, most of the experiments were done with healers. And it turns out that the effects are very much proportional to the intention of the healer. So the exact experiments that were done were measuring not the rewinding. So what you do is you heat the DNA, you partially unwind the two strands, and then over time they spontaneously go back to the intact helix, as I explained with the radionics. So when you do that kind of experiment, and here is it's been done with a healer and with a couple of machines. The Vibe machine is that inert gas thing I was telling you about, and in all cases the resistance. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is not electrical properties. This is rewinding. So the rewinding is slowed down, which is interesting. But the good news is that healers over here on the far right are actually more effective than any machine that the three different the two different machines that I used, two different kinds of healers, good healers and better healers, and they were always better than the machines, which is encouraging because some people might say that a healer is the machine is better than a healer. Anyway, so those are the experiments with the rewinding. And now I want to move on to another whole series of experiments measuring the electrical properties of DNA. I think I'm coming down with a cold. So it turns out that in the scientific literature, this is a phenomenon that was recently discovered, that DNA actually conducts electricity. It's called charge transfer. The charges are either protons, positively charged, or negatively charged electrons, and they propagate along the outside of the helix. They just kind of bounce from one location to another, but they also zip along in the central channel, and the speed that they propagate in the central channel is many times faster than theoretically predicted. So it's kind of an anomaly. It's actually considered a quantum property of the DNA. And the beauty about this system is that the faster the conductivity, in essence, what we're talking about here, the electrical charge transfer, is directly related to the ability of DNA to repair itself. So the more conductivity, the more self-repair. So that's a good thing. So in general, when you're treating DNA, you're looking for an increase in the conductivity or a decrease in the resistance, as I mentioned. And there's a lot of actual science about mismatched DNA and the conductivity and the whole charge transfer process. But the point, I don't need to review all the scientific literature, but the point is that I just lost my slides. I can't go back. Oh dear. Okay, good. The point is that these moving charges oscillate. So when they move, that's can be measured, as I say, with conductivity. But when they oscillate, that can be measured with the frequency signature, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, we're starting with just the moving conductivity, moving charges down the molecule. And that is done with a machine called impedance spectroscopy. And here's basically a device. It's a computer generated set of electrodes, and you measure the current flow between the two electrodes inside of a Faraday cage. And it's very sensitive measure. You put the DNA in the test tube and the two electrodes in the test tube, and you measure the conductivity. Okay, now the way I measure conductivity is not the way most people measure conductivity, because if you use a standard conductivity meter, you're taking measurements at an arbitrary fixed frequency of 2 kilohertz. And that is not the ideal way to do it. You need to measure the conductivity at one of the resonance frequencies of the target. So in this case, we're talking about DNA, and you'll see in a minute how I measure the frequencies of DNA, and discover that 27.4 is one of the resonance frequencies of DNA, intrinsic vibrational frequency of the molecule itself. So when I take conductivity measurements, I have a device, an impedance spectrophotometer that allows me to take conductivity measurements at any frequency I want. So these are the things that I do differently from everybody else. I measure the conductivity at a specific frequency. I use both AC and DC voltages at very weak amplitudes. I used flat Tesla coils as electrodes, counterwound, so they're creating some kind of a scalar field between them. And I use dissimilar metals as electrodes. Now, dissimilar metals turns out, silver and gold, turns out to be a whole thing in itself. So several scientific articles that talk about the use of dissimilar metals, the 3 publications down there at the bottom, with the use of dissimilar electrodes. And it turns out in between them is a Casimir force. And a Casimir energy is a quantum field. And they've actually measured quantum tunneling between the 2 electrodes. So between my 2 electrodes, I've got a scalar field and a quantum field and electrons and protons floating in between. So it's not an ordinary way to measure conductivity, but it's incredibly sensitive. I can say that about it. And okay, so here's some experiments that I do with scalar energy. This is scalar energy generated from a device called the Trinfinity 8. It's very sophisticated. It uses sacred geometry, but it also uses crystals that are 180 degree opposed to each other. And it has all kinds of programs with all kinds of frequencies that were channeled. And here's the experimental protocol. Normally, you hold the 2 electrodes. You can see the 2 electrodes here pointing at the DNA. DNA doesn't have hands, so to hold on to the electrodes, I just pointed them. And there's a computer screen generating sacred geometric patterns and God knows what kind of energy fields from the computer screen. Okay, so that's the setup, and here's the results. So these 3 particular programs. One is designed to increase your telomeres, one is designed for anti-aging, and the other is a spiritual thing for alignment with the divine. Well, the alignment with the divine had no change, a very small change in DNA. You can see the controls. The average control is about 18, 17, and here's the experimental error. So this change here is within the experimental error. So there is no real change with this particular program, but there's a large increase in the DNA conductivity. In this case, we're measuring conductivity for these 2 programs, which kind of makes sense because these are designed to resonate with DNA. And this was measured at yet another frequency, resonant frequency of DNA, and supporting the idea that this technology really works and it's specific and it's targeting, at least these 2 programs are targeting DNA. Okay, now we're moving on to my favorite subject, frequencies. And, Einstein talked about frequency. Tesla talked about frequency. Everybody's talking about frequencies. So how do you measure frequencies? Well, it's this same, it's a slightly different version of the impedance spectrophotometer. It's called nonlinear dielectric spectroscopy, where you apply a voltage at different frequencies and then measure the induced current in the second electrode. And it's a similar kind of setup that I use for measuring conductivity and dissimilar metals and, all flat Tesla coils, blah, blah, blah. And I observed some really rather unusual phenomena. And one of those is called frequency hopping, which means that when you take the same sample and you measure it over and over again, the first time you measure it, you might get a peak at 10 hertz. And then you do it again, and that is moved to 11 hertz or 12 hertz. So you've got this frequency hopping. It's not always exactly at the same place. And that phenomenon is actually in the physics literature. That's what it's called, frequency hopping. And I was delighted to see that in the scientific literature because that's what I'm observing in the lab. The other thing I'm observing is this, let's go right here to the positive and negative frequencies. So here's an example of the kind of response that I get from DNA. And you can see they're very discrete peaks that are positive, but like right here. But then here, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but right here is a negative frequency, and here's a negative frequency, and here's a negative frequency. So what does that mean? I don't know, but it turns out in the scientific literature, they talk about positive and negative frequencies. So to be quite honest, I don't know what a negative frequency is, but then, I don't really know what negative time is, and that shows up in all kinds of physics equations other than going backwards in time, which is sort of a concept you could more or less understand. But a negative frequency, I don't really know what that is. Open to discussion. Maybe some people have some ideas. We got engineers in the audience. And the excitation that I get in this technique, which I call resonance frequency spectroscopy, because it's measuring the resonance frequencies of the material in the region from 1 hertz all the way up to 100 kilohertz. And response, the induced current response, as I said, it varies in magnitude, it varies in polarity, it varies in shape, it varies in time. Sometimes it doesn't show up at all. You get a frequency of 10 and then 11, and you do it a third time, and there's nothing there at all. So it's a very complex phenomena, to say the least, and a lot of unknowns about what we're actually measuring, other than the intrinsic frequencies of the molecule. And as I said earlier, you take, in the case of a herbal product, you measure the frequencies and you put them back on the system. And I've done that also with yeast cells that were rapidly dividing. The frequencies have something to do with the physiological function of the yeast cells, because those frequencies actually stimulated the growth. And in the case of the herbal product, stimulated the energetic content of the product. So these frequencies are real, they're doing something, and as far as I can tell, nobody else is measuring them. So turns out that there is a longitudinal dipole moment in DNA. This is something I just discovered for this talk. There's a lot of written about the electrical properties of DNA. And, it has a dipole moment, it has conductivity, it has resistance, impedance, and all of that stuff. But when I discovered that one of its electrical properties had a longitudinal component, as described to oscillations of counter ions, like positive and negatively charged ions that stick to the DNA molecule, then I'm going like, well, that supports Miles' theory that DNA is a source is a source of scalar energy. It's vibrating in a longitudinal way, so the energy coming off the molecule is going to be a longitudinal scalar wave. So here we have. Sorry, I didn't quote the reference, but believe me, it's in the scientific literature. Okay, so here's an example of the many frequencies that I get for DNA, and there's the 27.4 that I used, and this is what I measure. And here's an example of how I'm measuring the effects of whatever kind of energy is coming off of this complex geometric three-dimensional shape, which you can see depicted graphically on the left, but what it actually looks like when it rotates. The whole thing rotates. Oh, so here's what it got. Obviously, it's got a geometry. The whole thing spins. It's got a color, so it has light. There's crystals. There's scalars. There's Fibonacci tones. This is an amazing technology called Evo 360, coming out of Holland. I met the scientist, and there's the website I Am Evo, and it's amazing technology. You spin it above your crown chakra, and all kinds of things happen. They measured questionnaires and all kinds of stuff. Well, I measured what it does to the DNA, the frequencies of DNA. Oh, this is what it does. It increases your willpower, your confidence, your ability to focus, raises your consciousness, all this great stuff. Oh, there's the guy, Chris Van Cleanput. And it's an amazing technology. And then when you measure how it resonates with DNA, it turns on some particular frequency at 1.4 kilohertz, but turns off other frequencies at 1.58. So I'm not sure what the significance of 1.41 kilohertz. Anybody in the audience have any idea? That would be great. but that was the observation. And since then, I've done a lot of other experiments looking at subtle energies and the frequencies of DNA. And here's another experiment that I did with Sandra Rose Michaels' EE system. And you can see that some frequencies get turned on, like the ones with the arrows, and some frequencies are lower, like right here after treatment, and some frequencies don't change at all. And that's to be expected because this is an enormously and information rich a way of measuring a property of a molecule. You've got all this information now. It turns out these are the frequencies that are turned on by this technology. Now, 96 kilohertz happens to be the exact frequency that a Qigong master turns on in the DNA when they treat DNA. So that's interesting. And right now I'm working with healers, trying to figure out what frequencies they turn on and what frequencies they turn on in common with each other. But that's outside the scope of this talk because I'm really wanting to focus on devices and scalar energy specifically. Okay, so conclusions. After having written this slide 3 times, it just doesn't want to be shown, so I'll have to go by memory. So what I've shown in this talk is that there is now hardcore, legitimate, published scientific evidence that longitudinal scalar waves exist, and the theory behind it and the experimental data to prove that can be transmitted over distances of up to 0.3 of a mile, which is a pretty long distance, actually. And then, in addition, I discussed the different kinds of ways of generating scalar waves and proposed that scalar waves would be generated by other methods in addition to self-canceling coils and bucking the two fields 180 degrees, which is the standard way to generate a scalar wave. Then I went on to describe my experiments with water, and I have a lot more on water. It's a whole talk by itself, what these frequency scalar energy does to water, what it does to living, growing cells in tissue culture, what it does to herbal extracts, and what it does to DNA. I measured the changes in DNA by several different methods, and they all support the same conclusion that this kind of energy clearly resonates with DNA and changes the DNA, which supports Constantine Miles' theory that that DNA itself is an antenna which broadcasts scalar energy throughout the body. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I am open for questions. Okay.
Well, we don't have any questions. To have some comments, though, here's one that says it was an interesting experiment, and that this was the first time that she heard of structured water being too rigid.
Right. Yeah, I was surprised myself, actually, because I was expecting, I love when that happens. Some people say that all the experiments that I do are influenced by my own mind and my own intention and my own ability to influence the system. And here's a good example where that's not the case, because my mind is going, oh yeah, scalar. I mean, the scalar waves. The structured water. It should be even stronger, and it's going to last longer. And blah, blah, blah. And when I get the exact opposite effect that I expect, then I go, okay, nothing to do with my mind. My mind was predicting something completely different.
Well, it's been an interesting evening here. I want to reiterate to everyone that our conference will be here in 2 weeks. And there's a comment. See that?
529. I have not tried 529. 528 is kind of a. I've looked at 528. Maybe that's the same frequency, because they do. As I said, they hop around a little bit. So 528 and 529 got to be the same. 528 does resonate with DNA, but actually 423 was much stronger. 432 was much stronger. And I'm sort of in the process now of char- characterizing what frequencies turn on DNA and what frequencies are the best, with the hopes of selling, I don't know, developing some kind of a device which would help people activate their DNA.
There you go. Can you share what modalities the healers are using in your study?
Okay. Well, as I said, the work that I've done with DNA and the work I've done with healers and the work I've done with machines are like I separate them into two separate lectures. I recently gave a lecture at the U.S. Psychotronics Association on the work I did with healers. But the interesting thing, I'll just summarize briefly since you asked the question, is that most healers slow down the rewinding of the DNA. If you remember that slide, when you separate the two strands and then they wind back together. And I can measure the time that that takes, the speed that that takes. And most healers, like Reiki healers, Qigong masters, they don't necessarily have a specific intention. They kind of do what they do when they treat a patient. So they put out their energy, and their intention is to influence the DNA or to influence the person or to make them better, to make them whole. And all of the techniques that I measured were slowing down the rewinding. And then I thought, well, okay, well, what if for whatever reason you think a healer would speed it up because it's going back to its intact shape, right? I mean, it's distorted, if you will, with the heat, and then it winds back into its normal intact shape. You would think a healer would speed that up. So all of the healers slow it down, and I'm racking my brain about why that is. The only thing I could come up with, improve the fidelity so that because the right base pairs have to line up all along the two strands. And if you do it slower, it's going to be more accurate and more refined and increase the fidelity. But then I studied the group out of California called the Reconnection, Eric Pearl's group. And I studied 3 of their healers, including Eric himself, and they all speeded up the rewinding of the two strands. And it's interesting that their intention, they don't really have an intention at all. They just bring down the energy. And they claim in their literature that they're bringing down a new kind of energy onto the planet. So when I heard that, I said, "Oh, okay, I got to do the DNA experiment with these guys. This is great." And lo and behold, they had the exact opposite effect of all of the other healers I tested. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. That the implications of that are very profound. To me, it suggests that there are 2 kinds of healers out there: the kind that speed up the body and the kind that slow it down. And if you go to a healer, you need to know which kind you need to go to. Depending on what's wrong with you, you may need to slow things down, or you may need to speed things up, or you may need to slow them down and then speed them up. So this kind of makes the whole field of energy healing a little bit more complicated, and was an interesting discovery of mine, to say the least.
Here's a comment. What happened if you use Ormus water?
I have not used Ormus water in the context of DNA. That's a great idea. Um, I I don't know. That's a great question. Have not done it. Stay tuned for my next lecture.
Okay, here you go. I am drawn to quartz. Uh,
Okay, quartz.
Crystal that the Earth made first, and then copper is found in gold veins, and the mercury is bound to the copper.
Okay, so let's talk about quartz. Well, let's talk about copper and mercury. There are certain metals that bind to DNA. Copper is one. I don't know about mercury. Mercury is usually pretty toxic, but the energy of mercury is used in Ayurvedic medicine. So that could very well be a healing thing when used at super low doses. Quartz, I have done some experiments with quartz and other types of crystals. That's another whole lecture. That lecture is about storing this kind of energy. And I've done it mostly with healers. I think I did one or two experiments with scalar energy. All energy can be stored in quartz. And then, as much as 2 or 3 months later, you put the DNA next to the quartz, which has been informed with either intention or a certain set of frequencies, and the information is still in the quartz, and the quartz is still emitting the energy, and that energy is still affecting the DNA. It's weaker. It does decrease gradually over time, but quartz can store these various forms of subtle energy that I've been talking about. That's a lecture that's out there. Just look on YouTube. I got a lot of lectures. And it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, here you go. Can you heal dye cell, like radiation dye cell?
I'm not sure what that is. A dye cell, a battery.
I wouldn't know. So,
If it's an inorganic, well, if it's an inorganic system, I wouldn't use the word heal. Healing only applies to organic systems. However, inorganic systems can store energy. And Bill Tiller, for example, has done a lot of work with that. His electronic circuit that he designed that stores healing energy, like crystals store healing energy. So if it's that kind of an inorganic system, yes, it can store energy and then can be used to radiate that energy to heal somebody, like a person or an animal.
so I'm gonna call it a night here. Glenn, thank you for being with us and everything.
My pleasure.
And
And good luck with the conference. And I hope it goes well. And sorry I can't make it this year. I've been at Steve's conference many years and look forward to our continued collaboration. Thank you, Steve, for the invitation.
thank you. And I want to remind everyone, we'll have one show next week, it looks like. And then we're going to be off the air for the month of August while we recover from the conference. So anyway, we'll see you in a week. In the meantime, get registered for the conference if you possibly can. I'd like to see you all there. And so you all have a great night. Thank you.